Hello, everybody. Welcome to the webinar on the Opportunity Zones program. We're glad you could join us today. We're very excited to be able to go over this brand new initiative, a really exciting new program for community economic development that we're hoping you'll learn more about, or for those that have a little information, really get a little deeper into the weeds. So today we're joined by a special guest, John Lettieri from the Economic Innovation Group. They were kind of the founders of this initiative in DC. John is the co-founder of the EIG and the Senior Director for Policy and Strategy. John's going to walk us through, he's sitting next to me, and he's going to walk us through kind of the legislative history, where did this come from, the need for this program, and kind of the nuts and bolts of how it works. And then I'm going to get into a little more detail about what LISC has been up to on the policy side, the advocacy side, working with this program. And then we'll be joined also with Kevin Boes. Kevin, for those in the LISC family know him well, is the president and CEO of our New Market Support Company. They're also the group that's going to kind of be taking the lead on implementation from LISC perspective, making this program really work for us and for our needs in the community. So Kevin will join to cover that piece of the conversation. And then we'll hopefully have plenty of time left for your questions and answers after we do our presentations. So before I turn over to John, just a couple of real quick logistical matters. Everyone on the phone is muted. We are taking questions only by the chat function in your on the webinar. So open up that portal, and you should be able to submit questions via that. And we'll queue up the questions. They'll probably wait till the end of all three of the presentations, which collectively will be about a half hour to start answering those questions. So feel free to send them anytime, and then we'll start addressing those after the end of the presentations. So with that, I think that's the main logistical stuff. I'm going to turn it over to John Lettieri with the EIG.
Thanks, Matt. It's great to be with all of you, and we really appreciate all the work that LISC is doing in this space already to make this a success, and we look forward to being a close partner with you on implementation. So I'm going to give a little bit of an overview of the background of the program itself, what needs it's intended to address, some of the mechanics of the tax incentive. We'll save a lot of the details, I'm sure, for Q&A, but let me briefly touch on the history here. This was born out of a concern over the uneven nature of the economic recovery. The recession was a clear line of demarcation in the economy in terms of the way that communities were experiencing the benefit of economic growth. EIG is a nonprofit bipartisan research and advocacy organization based in DC. One of our big products is the Distressed Communities Index, which some of you may be familiar with. That research has been used to essentially heat map the country against 7 different indicators of economic prosperity, and to better analyze what's the nature of economic growth and how it's being experienced at the community level post-recession. One of the things we found in our research is roughly 52 million people live in what we consider an economically distressed community, which we look at the zip code level. And those are communities that really, even as the U.S. economy as a whole has done quite well since the recession, they've experienced an ongoing recession, losing 6% of their jobs, 6% of their businesses on average during prime years of the economic recovery. So that was really a primary motivation for looking for a solution that helped to finance, in particular, business activity and other types of development where there's currently a disinvestment crisis going on. So as I just mentioned, if you look at the unemployment and establishment growth since the recession, so much of that national story is being driven by a relatively narrow swath of communities, those in the prosperous tier. If you look at just employment, it's roughly 25% employment growth since over those first 5 prime years of the recovery, 12% establishment growth, and in the midst of that, 6% in both jobs and businesses being lost to the distressed community level. Looking at the next slide, one of the national challenges we face more broadly is a decline in startup activity, business formation activity. This is something that has accelerated pretty dramatically during the recession. We haven't seen any real recovery of that since the recession, but where it's felt the worst is in low-income communities, where, again, as we just saw in the previous slide, you have what amounts to a business recession ongoing even well into the prime years of the national recovery. So that sets the stage nicely for why this piece of legislation, why this initiative is so important. Look at the next slide. The Opportunity Zones program was a bipartisan, bicameral effort first introduced in 2016 by Cory Booker and Tim Scott in the Senate and Pat Tiberi and Ron Kind in the House. It went on to attract nearly 100 co-sponsors, politically and regionally very diverse. setting the stage for getting it implemented into the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act at the end of last year and passed into law as part of that broader tax reform effort. It's intended to facilitate long-term private equity investments into distressed communities. It is, in essence, the largest community development incentive to be implemented since the New Markets Tax Credit at the end of the Clinton administration. So this is a truly once-in-a-generation opportunity to move the ball forward, we think, for investment and growth in low-income areas. It takes a very different approach than what previous programs have taken, one that we think is complementary to programs like the New Markets Tax Credit, but uses a very different mechanism for spurring the investment. So before we dive into the specifics, I want to talk about a few of the kind of the basic principles. The first is this is an investor-driven incentive, not one that goes to the individual companies or underlying businesses or projects themselves. All of the incentives that underlie the Opportunity Zones program are related to the tax treatment of capital gains and all relate to the longevity of an investor's commitment to opportunity funds. These are geared more towards new businesses and new projects than incumbent businesses. It's market-based, meaning that the scale of capital that's going to move is based on investor interest. There's not an allocation that's involved every year, nor is there a cap on the amount of capital that can move. So it is flexible and scalable in that context. And also, I want to say at the outset, we certainly don't believe that capital alone is a strategy or a solution. It's part of it. We hope that this is a catalyst for a lot of other follow-on activity, much of which LISC is responsible for helping to provide in communities around the country. It goes beyond just capital. It goes into support, workforce development, zoning, permitting, all kinds of other things that are going to be necessary for communities to thrive. The capital is simply a catalyst for a lot of that activity. The next slide. So first, how do opportunity zones get designated? The legislation gives governors the lead allocation authority. They can use, much like a New Markets Tax Credit, they can use the low-income census tracts in their states to create opportunity zones. And the cap on that is that they may use up to 25% of the low-income tracts in a given state for the formation of opportunity zones. The governors are given broad discretion here, so they can use additional criteria. The federal standard is a baseline, and they can use additional criteria in their zone selections. But at the end of the day, for every 100 low-income tracts that are in a state, 25 of those can be used for the creation of opportunity zones. They can be as big or small as governors see fit. I think the goal here, obviously, is for them to be larger and more contiguous clusters of tracts so that a variety of activities can take place within those zones. But again, a lot of deference is given to governors as the heads of economic development in their states to make those decisions. Governors are on the clock now. So in terms of the timing, we're about halfway through the zone designation process. They have until March 21st to either submit their designations or ask for an extension, which would take them to April 20th as the deadline for submitting their zone designations to Treasury. And Congress asked them to take 3 additional things into consideration when making their zone designations. First, what types of places can also be the focus of mutually reinforcing state, local, or private development activities? Second, which are the places that have demonstrated some success already in utilizing programs like NMTC, enterprise zones, promise zones, et cetera? And 3, where can this be applied to places that have recently suffered major losses of jobs or business closures, and where this can be a corrective mechanism to help restore economic activity to a certain place? So those are non-binding, but those are things that Congress wanted governors to take into consideration when making their decisions. Next slide. So how does the incentive work? As I said earlier, all of the elements of the incentive are tied to the tax treatment of capital gains, and all of them are tied to the longevity of an investor's commitment. So the longer an investor stays invested, the more potential tax upside they're eligible for. The first piece is a temporary deferral, which ends December 31, 2026, but allows them to roll capital gains tax deferred into an opportunity fund and delay the tax event until either they withdraw from the opportunity fund or that date certain, whichever comes first. The second is they're eligible for a reduction in capital gains on what they roll in. So after 5 years, that's a 10% reduction. After 7 years, it's an additional 5%. So in other words, you can take $100 of capital gains liability down to $85 for longevity of holding. The third piece relates to the second tranche of capital gains. That is, whatever you accrue within an opportunity fund, after 10 years of holding your stake in the fund, that's tax exempt. for those longer-term holdings. That's really where the bulk of the incentive rests for investors. So instead of an upfront tax credit on the back end for long-term investors, if they have additional gains, that's where they're going to see the most upside. And obviously the goal there is to keep them as engaged and have their capital in the game as long as possible. So that takes us to what are opportunity funds. Opportunity funds are the special vehicles that get designated through this legislation for the deployment of the capital. So investors must go through an opportunity fund in order to get the tax benefit under the program. Opportunity funds are envisioned either as corporations or partnerships. They're market-based, so again, the private sector will need to establish them. States and regions could also establish them in a public-private partnership context. We imagine most of these will be private constructs. In addition to their legal status, they have to be, as vehicles, investing 90+% of their assets in opportunity zones. They're not tied to any specific opportunity zones. They can be as local or national in scope as they choose. But the question, the test for opportunity funds is how much of their assets they have invested. So in other words, these are meant to be new special purpose investment vehicles created for the specific purpose of investing in opportunity zone areas. Who can invest in opportunity zones? We think that's a wide open question. We've been talking to a number of different types of investors, a pretty wide array. We think everybody from angel and venture capital investors, impact investors, CDFIs, banks, institutional investors, they all have an opportunity to create funds and to deploy capital through those products. And we think there's going to be a wide array of both investors and types of investments that get catalyzed. So what can they invest in? In short, they can invest in stock, partnership interest, or tangible property. The legislation skews heavily towards new development, so new businesses, new projects. For existing assets, there's an improvement test to ensure that these are not just speculative investments to buy and hold an asset and reap the tax benefit. The improvement test is essentially 100% on an existing asset within a constrained period of time. So again, the goal there being to spur follow-on productive economic activity, not just the holding of assets. But in broad terms, the types of investable opportunities is very wide. Everything from operating businesses, energy projects, housing and real estate, and everything in between, as long as they meet the parameters prescribed by the legislation. I want to briefly talk about what's different. So there are a lot of community development incentives and programs that have shown some degrees of success in the past, and some that are currently on the books. This is meant to be a complement to those. So the most direct complementary program is New Markets Tax Credit, again, using the same underlying criteria for where investment would go into those low-income communities. This is an equity investment vehicle incentive, so it's geared more towards the equity investment than it is towards lending, where there's other programs that currently do financing. But what's so important about this is the scalability of it. Because there's no allocation being made from the public sector, and because investors are being asked to take their own capital at market risk and rolling it into the funds, there's a speed to market with that you can't achieve through other programs where there's a fixed allocation being made. And there's a scalability to it as well. So the incentive is more shallow than a tax credit would be up front, but the nimbleness of the incentive is greater. And so therefore, particularly for operating businesses who need capital in real time, we think it's going to be a much more useful incentive than some others have been. And we also think the scale of capital on a nationwide scale that we could see move is quite large. So again, at this point it's all speculation, but we know that without a cap and with that flexibility, there's the potential to draw on a very wide array of investors for a wide array of activities, which is important because no two low-income communities are the same. My last slide here. So Matt, I think, is going to talk more about some next steps as well, but the most immediate priority is zone designation. So as I said earlier, we're about halfway through the designation process. It's critically important that interested parties, local stakeholders, are engaging with governors to ensure that they have the benefit of your local insight about where there are certain needs and opportunities for this tool to be a perfect match with the local strategy and the local needs. As I said earlier, it's about a 4-month process from date of enactment to the deadline. We're halfway through it. We're talking to a number of governors around the country. I'm happy to answer those questions during the Q&A. But that first priority, the zone designation is going to set the table for everything that happens next. If the zones are thoughtfully chosen, and if governors stay engaged beyond the designation itself and help to bring together stakeholders, bring together investors, recruit the investment, ensure that the local impact is as intended, the sky is the limit for the potential here. But if it's not thoughtfully done, and if there's not that type of ongoing engagement, obviously that's going to mute the impact of the program. So it's so critical that folks are engaged with governors now. The second piece I'll just mention before I close is the funds themselves. Getting the word out to potential investors of all types, corporations, individuals, the fund managers themselves. That's a whole infrastructure that has to be built to deploy the capital, and that has to happen in real time. So that's something we're very focused on. We look forward to working with you all on that same issue, but that's another area where today we hope that there's a lot of that type of activity gearing up so that once the zones are designated and once the regulations have been issued, there's the ability to quickly go into the deployment phase of the capital, because this is a time-limited program. The incentive window ends in roughly 9 years for new investment coming in, which means the earlier we can get capital off the sidelines, the more upside there is for investors and the more benefit there will be to communities. Let me stop there and turn it back to Matt.
All right, thanks, John. Very helpful. I'm going to pick up with the point where you left off on about the timeline and what people could be doing now. So the most critical thing is the clock is already ticking, right? You know, the statute required that the states submit their designations to Treasury Department within 60 days of enactment of the statute, not within 60 days of Treasury issuing regulations or guidance. So a lot of people were operating in the blind, and I think a lot of the states probably didn't even know this was coming their way. So a lot of people have been scrambling, and I'm very proud of the local LISC offices for all your efforts to start reaching out to your states to identify your census tracts. So I think that's been very helpful, and I'd encourage a lot of our rural partners that are on the phone to follow up with Suzanne or me afterwards. We can get you some of these materials as well, and for other partners in the localities where our LISC offices are located, check with them and see what the census tracts they're identifying, and to echo those would be a fantastic thing to do. So yes, the states are now working under this window. They have until March 21st to submit their request to Treasury Department. They can get a 30-day extension at their request, so they can have through April 21st, and the Treasury Department actually only has 30 days from when they receive the request from the states to approve them, although with I guess with the mutual agreement with the state, they could extend that to 60 days. So this whole process is going to be over sooner than later, so now is the time to start weighing in. So what we've advised, in addition to working with them to identify specific census tracts, which we'll get into in a moment, we're also considering some broad issues that states should really consider. So that, and part of that is that, you know, they should be thinking about when they're setting up their census tracts. They can do up to 25% of their eligible census tracts throughout the state, and that can be pretty big pockets. They can be pretty scattered all around. We think it's important to identify, maybe not even to use that maximum authority, because it's more important, I think, to concentrate investments into the areas that need it most, whether it's a rural community or an urban one, so it can be more catalytic, right? You might not have as much impact if all the investments are scattered. When you really can concentrate on the neighborhoods, the rural communities that need it the most, that should be, I think, a prime consideration in our opinion. We think that much like in the New Markets program, you kind of get rewarded if you're serving severely economically distressed communities as opposed to kind of the low-hanging fruit, minimally economically distressed neighborhoods. That would be a good area for the state to consider targeting the resources. And also it's very important to have the balance of urban and rural communities, and let's not also forget the smaller cities as well that need these kind of investments. As far as identifying the census tracts, the CDFI fund now has materials out where they've identified all the eligible tracts that are eligible because of their basic criteria of being new market tax credit eligible, but also there is the exception rule that up to 5% of the census tracts can also be identified if they're adjacent to a qualifying tract, and if they have a median family income that's at 125%, right below the area, they could also be considered. So there is some flexibility to pull in a couple adjacent census tracts. So the CDFI fund materials are all up there. The new markets team, Kevin can talk about this a little more, has just released their own mapping materials that's available to the public as well. So that's another great way to start mapping some of these as you consider identifying which tracts you want your governors to consider. In many states, we have a slide later, many states have actually set up Opportunity Zone websites. There's actually public portals where people can go. I know Ohio I visited, and you can go submit your information to them directly. So you should also be looking into those materials as well. And then after we get through this nomination period, I think there's still critical advocacy you can be doing at the state levels to really encourage the states to try to drive other investment opportunities, like other credits they can make available, other incentives to work within the opportunity zone so they can kind of couple up the benefits to really drive more investments that way. And also, we feel really strongly that we want the investments in the opportunity zones to really benefit the residents of the zones, whether that's good, high-quality jobs for community residents, whether it's valuable services in the community, affordable housing. Those are all things that can benefit low-income community residents, and I think that's to the spirit of the rules. On the federal advocacy, there's also an opportunity. I mean, the Treasury Department just released its first set of guidance around to the states, to the governors, to kind of give them a little more guidance as they develop their zones. I think this is the first of other guidance that will come out from Treasury Department in rulemaking, so I think it's never too early to put your 2 cents in. So LISC took advantage of that the other day. We submitted comments to the IRS. I'll briefly, what we focused on were both guidance around the designating the opportunity zones as well as the certification of the funds, kind of the 2 big buckets that are out there now. There will be some more rulemaking they're going to need on what is a qualifying business and a lot of other things, but for the time being, we want to focus on these first 2 things. So our comments, which if they're not already, will be on our website, I think, by the end of the day. On the designation of opportunity zones, we were first and foremost recommending that this should be delegated to the CDFI fund at the Treasury Department. This would be very similar to the New Markets Program, where there's pieces that are delegated to the IRS and pieces to the CDFI fund. We think that the designation of the zones is very consistent with what the fund has done in identifying low-income communities under its other award programs. They all have the mapping tools already in place, and it's going to be easier, I think, for them to make these determinations. We also are recommending that this not just be a mechanical exercise of did a census tract meet the requirements or not, is it less than 25% of the state's total, check, you're good to go. As John referenced in the conference report, there were some three things that governors were told to consider. Is it the focus of mutually reinforcing state, local, and private development initiatives? Is there success with other programs like New Markets, Enterprise Zones, Promise Zones? And has the community suffered major job losses from plans for relocations? So we'd like to see the Treasury actually collect that information from the states, to see what did they use to determine their zones, and did they meet one of these 3 criteria, I think is consistent with what was intended per the conference report language. The other piece we talk about is the certification of the opportunity funds. Again, we think that should be delegated to the CDFI fund. They do this already with certifying CDFIs, certifying community development entities under the New Markets Program. They have all these kind of systems in place that probably with slight modification could make for very easy certification of the funds, and that's what we want. We don't want this to be backlogged to the IRS. We want to be able to use electronic systems, get the stuff up and running. We're noting that there's the 2 elements of the certification for the fund is around there's a legal entity that's easy to meet. You form the fund. You have a mission of serving these opportunity zones. That's pretty easy to establish when you incorporate, and that's kind of what we think should be done at the initial certification. The other major requirement is that 90% of your assets are invested in opportunity zone communities, but typically that's not the model. As you're trying to attract investments, you're going to need to show you're a certified opportunity fund, and then the investments come. So there's a little bit of a chicken and egg thing going on. So we're telling the CFI fund, do the 90% assets tests after the investments have been made. So let's get these groups certified, let's get the investor dollars out there and put them to work, and then assure throughout the compliance period that they're always at 90%. That's one of our comments. We want to, there was another part of the conference report language that had indicated that the certification of the funds should be kind of similar to along the lines of how the new market tax credits are allocated. I think that the allocation process is a little unreasonable for this program. I mean, you don't want to have a competitive application for this. We want this program out and up and running, and investor capital put into the community, so we don't think there's a role for a competitive application process. But there are certain elements of the New Markets Program that you score more, right? When you apply for the credits, you score more if you're serving a severely distressed community, or you're committing more than the minimally statutory requirement amount of funds into communities. You're bringing benefits to the residents of the communities. So we think that there should be a role at the time of certification for the opportunity funds to indicate that they're going to meet at least one of a menu of community development outcomes as part of their investments, and we want that menu to be broad enough to, so that a lot of different business models can meet it. But we think there's a certain set of requirements they could minimally say, yeah, we'll do that, and that should be part of the certification. And then the compliance, when they're doing the reporting, they can show how they've met one or more of these requirements. We're also recommending that the CDFI fund, at the time of certification, collect basic baseline information about what's your what markets are you going to serve, what asset classes you want to invest in, because that way it can be a matchmaking tool now for people out in the industry, whether you're an investor or you have projects. You can start aligning yourself with some of these funds. So we're kind of recommending that as well. And that's a little something similar to, they do that for new market tax credits. So we think that would be really helpful as well. Okay, those were kind of in our comments. Like I said, if they're not already on our website, they will be, and I think there'll be a link in the presentation where you can link onto those as well. So with that, I think we're going to be turning it over to Kevin Boes to talk a little about what LISC envisions, how we can see this program helping us and our community partners. And Kevin, hopefully you're on board. There he is.
Yeah. Can you all hear me?
Yeah, loud and clear.
Great. Well, thanks, Matt, and thanks, John, and thanks to everyone for joining us today on this important topic. So I get the role of talking about the fun part of this and what we're going to do with this program once it's up and running, and our path forward here. So first topic, first bullet is program impact and our focus there, and know that Matt mentioned this in his comments. But what we're thinking about on the impact side is that while we're certainly advocating for this program to be for the CDFI fund and Treasury to have an impact focus, we're really seeing this ultimately being largely a market-driven force that will make this a market-driven program impact, and that we really don't want to see this program having the reputation as being a payday lending and self-storage facility financing program. And so our goal is to take a leadership role in that, to partner with other mission-oriented folks, foundations, and we see a big role here for state and local governments to have piggyback programs and to have an impact focus that goes along with this program. And also see a role for us and other like-minded folks in a process of certifying these funds and impact reporting, and think that if that's not being done with as much of an impact focus as we'd like at the federal level, that there may be a way for the private community to put a stamp of approval on these funds and to do some impact reporting work that can really drive the impact of this work as we move forward. So then moving on to investment focus and what we're planning at LISC and what we are seeing that other folks are planning on as they're going to launch these opportunity funds and get moving on this. So at LISC, we are planning on focusing this work on our economic development strategy and job creation as a primary focus. And so as we're thinking about that, we're thinking about opportunity funds that will provide growth capital to businesses that are creating quality living wage jobs in these opportunity zones in these communities that we work. And also thinking about the real estate infrastructure and business assets that are in these communities, and both building new and improving those assets to make these communities places that businesses want to be located. So that's the job creation, economic development side for us. Second, as Matt mentioned, is affordable housing, and we see this as being a very important tool for the development of new, affordable, and workforce housing in these communities. A couple different methods we see to get there with opportunity funds. One could be a model where we just put an equity tranche of capital into new multifamily developments. and TOD type properties and other things. A second could be a model where our funds actually own single family and multifamily real estate assets and lease those out to these at affordable rates and potentially with a lease to own type of a structure where after this 10-year period that the program incentivizes investors to be in, that we could then turn those units over to the residents and they could own and have a vested, long-term vested interest in living in these markets. Third area of investment focus that we see is we see this program being used for a lot of single asset funds. So somewhat similar to what we're doing with our new markets tax credit work, but this could be something like taking a dark shopping mall in one of these opportunity zones and using a opportunity fund model to put in an equity tranche of capital that would help to turn that into a new mixed use or housing development in the zone. Many different examples of how a single asset fund could work in this space. So then moving on to the investor side of the equation, and as John and Matt talked about, this is a big opportunity and a big challenge for our space here to put this whole new asset class into play for these investors that are largely outside of the world that we currently work in at LISC and in the community development field, as we're thinking about individual investors, high net worth, and family office types of folks, and getting them engaged here. But the opportunity, I think, goes beyond just these opportunity funds for these investors, and so our plan is to not only get them engaged as investors in our new opportunity funds and opportunity funds that our partners are setting up around the country, but also to think about other ways that we can engage these folks in our work, whether it be grant opportunities, whether it be getting them engaged in some of our crowdfunding work with helping to invest in our Kiva clients or other crowdfunding resources in our communities, and even mentorship opportunities for businesses that we're working with that these individual investors could be interested in engaging with us in all these things. So then finally, just a few things on partnerships, and as this is a whole new industry coming together here, we see a huge role for partners, both working with our existing partners and all of you on the call, and some new partnership opportunities that are going to come out of this program. So on that side of things, a big one is working more with local governments and with state governments and their economic development operations in doing what we can on the policy side of things to use existing programs that exist in these municipalities and states for economic development and affordable housing, and making them work for this opportunity fund business, and also hopefully working with them to develop new tools in their toolkit that will drive investment into their state and into these communities and help the program be more successful. Second new partnership opportunity we see is working with private equity firms and REITs and folks that are already out doing this type of equity investment work to a large scale, and working with us, we could have a new impact focus to the business they're doing and really expand the use of this program, working with those folks that are already out doing the same types of investments, but maybe not focused in the areas that they can now be with this program and the new tools in the toolkit. And then finally, on the topic of new partnerships, community foundations, I think, could be a big partner in this work, as they're already working with a lot of these high net worth and impact investor folks, and have a lot of the same goals that we do, and so using those community foundations as an avenue to attract these investors to the space, and then working with them to further their goals at the same time. And then in addition to those new partnerships, see a lot of opportunity here for all of our current partners, whether it be local CDFIs and CDCs and developers, our bank partners and national foundation partners are all going to have a big role in this program being successful and having the community impacts that we're looking for. And then finally, we're already having some conversations and see a big opportunity for anchor institutions to be a big part of the puzzle here. And a lot of those anchors are based in these communities that are going to be designated as zones, and working with them, we can hopefully expand opportunities for supplier diversity programs and affordable housing around those anchors and to improve those communities. So with that, I will, I think, turn it back to Matt. And are we going to open up for questions?
Yeah, we have one more slide around additional resources, which I could do, or Kevin. But these are, and these will be live links in their presentations once we distribute them.
They should be, yes.
So this is we now have our own Opportunity Zone webpage, and like I said, Kevin, you have some new mapping materials up there, right?
You got it.
Yeah. So, and briefly, what will they be able to get from our maps?
So our mapping tool, a little bit different than what you can get off the CDFI fund or some other sites, and it's really a tool focused where you can focus specifically on a state and look at just what tracts are eligible, and then you can look at a specific county in a state and then dive into those census tracts and get more information on both the demographics of that census tract, but also what investment activity has already happened there, which can really help with the advocacy to the states and in the future to investors that there are opportunities and investments already happening in these markets, and so we're going to continue adding data resources to that mapping tool as the program develops, and we'll include the designations after those are made by April 20th.
Excellent. And then we have a link to the EIG's website, which has some great materials, including recently you guys put up a kind of like a, I won't call it a prospectus, but a kind of the how the returns might look based on the investments, I think is really helpful. That's on the page now, and a lot of the other information, you have your own mapping tools as well.
We've linked to other people's mapping tools, yes.
Yes, good, very efficient. There's a governor's offices, contact information links, some state sites, the original legislation, the CDFI funds website page around the opportunity zones, the recent IRS rules. So those are some of the key resources that you all can look for. And I think with that now, Jessica, have we lined up some questions?
We've received a lot of questions, so we'll start going through the questions.
We're sorry we don't have a two-way camera to get Jessica.
That's okay.
But we might need you to read those for us.
All right, so first question is, what would stop either legally or functionally a governor from designating only tracts that are used exclusively for public purposes? Examples, schools, hospitals, public housing.
Probably, I mean, as long as they meet the definitions as set forth. And I would hope to think that the governors wouldn't be looking to only do those kind of tracks. I think they're certainly incentivized to look at broader economic development. I would like to think most of that's where their interest would be. But
functionally, it would be a bit of an own goal because if it's a private incentive and the tracks that they choose are not fit for private development projects of some type or private business activity, then it's essentially going to be a meaningless exercise in the state. So I don't see that as being a likely functional outcome of the incentive.
Yeah. Okay. Next question.
Next question. Is the exemption for the original cap gain and the new gain from the opportunity investments, or just the new gain?
Just the new gain. The step up in basis would be for the original gain. That's up to no more than 15%. But the 10-year plus exemption is for only gain accrued within an opportunity fund, so the second tranche.
Yeah. So you have to keep your investment in that fund for 10 years.
10 years.
Then after 10 years, there will be no capital gains on that investment in the fund. Okay.
All right. How do you ensure that these funds won't be a vehicle for accelerating gentrification? For example, private banks using the funds to invest in real estate in low-income minority neighborhoods.
So it's, you know, that's where one of the challenges is with a market-based program that's deliberately designed to kind of let the states identify the census tracts that they want to use, let the investors in the market kind of figure that out. That's one of the things that we're trying to put some kind of guardrails around community development at the time of certification. Again, hopefully in a way that is not going to slow down use of the program, but kind of keeps the investors and the opportunity funds a little honest about where they're making the investments. I think it's why it's also critical this next, you know, 30-day period that people are really advising the governors to pick the right census tracts, not the ones that are already gentrifying and don't really need this incentive for investing, but the ones that really need this extra push.
Okay. Next question, will states be competing against each other to offer up the best investment returns to investors?
So that one to you.
Yeah, well, states obviously already compete with each other for new investment. This is a little different in the sense that it's not, it doesn't inherently hollow out the local tax base. There's not the nature of this incentive is going to be, I think, driving more of a race to the top than a race to the bottom, in the sense that you can have two places that are equally low income on paper, but one place has done more to provide the kind of practical support and other types of engagement that states and cities own, not the federal government, that will make a place more attractive than another place for certain types of capital. And so we think that'll certainly be part of the competition. It's more the model and the strategy around this than it is the dollars and cents incentive, which is at the federal level it's fixed. But what types of places are going to be most benefited, I think, are the ones that have the broadest and deepest strategy to wrap around the incentive itself.
And I do think there's an opportunity in that competitive nature of this program in, you know, our advocacy efforts to the states and local governments, you know, around these impact strategies and having programs in place that can, you know, further the investment incentive and align with our strategies.
Next question.
Could we combine opportunity funds into a SBIC or RBIC?
So those are SBICs, Small Business Investment Company, certified by the SBA. RBICs, I don't remember if that's SBA or a USBA program.
Yeah, the RBICs are USDA's version of the SBIC. So, you know, private equity tools that are funds that are certified by the SBA and by the USDA. It's a good question. I think that I don't think there's going to be any issues with, you should be able to piggyback those programs, but you know, we'll have to wait and see as it develops what the real opportunities are there. You know, it'd really be a question of whether the investors in those funds want to roll capital gains in, but I think the structure should work.
Yeah, and to Kevin's point, there's nothing in the statute that talks at all about like using this with other programs. Like, for example, a new markets program, there was a specific prohibition against twinning new markets with the low-income housing tax credit. But that was about the only exception in the statute, and the IRS didn't really make any other further interpretations about combining with other sources. So you saw often new markets would be, excuse me, twinned with historic tax credits. So we'll have to see if Treasury or IRS wants to add any kind of restrictions around the other tax credits or other federal funding programs like SBICs, but as of now, there is no limitation in the statute.
Great. All right, next question. What happens if operating businesses move after an opportunity fund invest in them? Is there recapture risk for IRS to come back for its lost capital gains?
No. There's no recapture risk, but there's a penalty for funds. As was mentioned earlier, funds have to meet the 90% asset test in qualified property within zones. So if at any point during the twice-a-year testing for that IRS will execute, they don't meet that, there's a penalty on the percentage of the fund differential that's not in compliance. It's not designed to be catastrophic. It's designed to because again, there's been no allocation like there would be with an MTC type of project. So it's not meant to claw back in real time, but it's meant to provide the goad, so to speak, to ensure that funds are staying within that boundary. But again, because these are special purpose vehicles that have been created specifically for this purpose, this is a test that we think most funds will have no trouble meeting.
Yeah, and I think as with the New Markets program, and this is why people aren't really focused on it now, but they will need to be at some point. There's going to be regulations around the whole what qualifies as a qualifying investment. In the New Markets program, they would give safe harbor periods where, like, if you didn't meet the test, because like a company moved out, they might say, well, okay, but if you got that capital back and then reinvested it within a year or within a certain period, then you'd be held harmless. So there will be some protection.
That's right, and there is an off-ramping provision in the statute that says once a investment no longer qualifies, you have a period of time as a fund to dispose of the asset. So there is something still needs regulatory filling in the blanks around that, how that's actually going to work, but it is envisioned in the statute that there needs to be some kind of off-ramping, both for the business and for the investors, so that it's not a kind of an immediate penalty.
Right.
Great. How does this program interact with CRA?
With the CRA, so the Community Reinvestment Act, which banks, most of you probably are familiar with the program, but basically banks are kind of obligated to reinvest capital in the communities where they draw from, particularly traditionally low-income communities. I would imagine that that these kinds of investments would be perfectly align well with CRA. That actually the regulatory agencies have now kind of gone as far as to say certain things like low-income housing tax credits and market tax credit investments automatically qualify, or at least they have very low hurdles. Once they see that, it's kind of a good housekeeping seal. So maybe even the regulators will move in that direction. The bigger question is, and I don't know if Kevin or John could answer this, I don't know if they'll be the same investors. I don't know if the banks will be as active as investors in this credit. I keep calling them credit because they don't have as much capital gains tax liabilities, I think, as other particularly high net worth individuals would have. So I don't know if this will become a big investment tool for the CRA motivated banks like the housing credit and New Markets are. So I don't know if you guys want to address that on the side issue.
I think it's still an open question. Yep. You're right. IRS would have to graft this in, or certain types of investments within opportunity funds in, and it's still an open question. I think banks will be active in at least providing products for opportunity fund type of investment, but how much they invest from their own balance sheet and pursuit of CRA credit, I think, is up in the air.
Yeah, we're talking to some banks that have some appetite in some capital gains exposure that they could use in the program, but see partnerships with banks here largely being some lending work to these same projects, outside of the opportunity fund structure.
All right, the next question is there thought to extend beyond 2026 as this becomes less a valuable tool as years go by? In addition, why was 2026 picked as a date versus have it on a rolling base on initial investment?
I'm going to let you handle that one, John.
2026, good question. So the gain recognition date, or the end of the deferral window at the end of 2026, was chosen for a reason that's really very specific to the way Congress scores provisions. So to keep the cost of the program low and therefore make it possible to pass a version of this concept, the gain recognition had to happen and be recaptured by Treasury within the 10-year scoring window. And so that means end of year 9 after date of enactment, so that's paid in year 10 and counted as not lost revenue, essentially. So it lowers the revenue profile of the bill, which was quite effective because that was the sweetener for getting this included in tax reform. To the question about extension, it's totally up in the air. It is certainly extendable, so that, for instance, you could say since it's going to take a year for the program to get stood up, and that's a year that investors really can't execute the investments, and therefore the incentive's not accessible to them. You could see them extending it maybe a year to recoup that lost time, but we're way ahead of that being a reality or even really an activity yet. But more to the point, you could see another tranche of opportunity zone allocations happening if the program's successful, let's say in 5 years. Congress could act again to say now instead of just that first 25%, now governors can allocate a different tranche of their low-income census tracts for essentially another round of this. So with this model, there's a lot of permutations that could exist.
All right, excellent. So we have a lot of questions, and I realize we only have about 7 minutes left. One question I've seen a few come up is, are the slides going to be available? And the answer to that is yes.
The slides will be available. We're hearing that the links are not working, so we will make sure that a new PowerPoint is sent around with the links that work. So we will be sure to get that to you.
One question I'm seeing, we mentioned that presumably IRS doesn't put out regulations saying differently. Is it likely to be combined with LIHTC or new markets? Kevin, do you want to just address that quickly? Could you see the tool being devised, product being devised alongside those programs?
Yeah, I do think that at some level there will be some twinning with LIHTC and new markets tax credits. I don't see it as being the primary use of the program by any means, I think on the LIHTC side, it really depends on how strong the investor market is, and that if the capital is flowing as it is, I think it's going to be a somewhat difficult structure to layer in the opportunity fund investors, but it certainly can happen.
Yeah, and what about we have a similar question about the returns that people expect. Do you think it's going to be similar to new markets and the housing credit? My guess is we're probably going to seek higher returns. Kevin, do you want to start that?
Sure. Yeah, I think that it's going to be all over the board here, and I think it's a very different type of return than a tax credit return, and so it really is going to depend on what assets are being invested in, and to the extent that it's lower risk real estate, expect returns to reflect the market there, and if we're talking about venture capital and business private equity, investor return expectations will probably be largely what they are in the broader space there. And really, as we're looking at that and thinking about investor returns, we're really thinking about the potential for some leveling of the playing field for these higher impact funds, where we work with foundation partners and others for credit enhancement resources, and bringing in other state and local government resources, so the playing field is sort of leveled, and so these high impact funds can have similar risk-rated returns to others that might not have such a mission focus.
Great. Next question. Our mayor's office is under the impression that only mayors can recommend tracts or opportunity zone designations. Is there any basis for this belief?
Well, I'll take that. Every state is different, obviously, in its process, but there's nothing in the statute that limits who can provide feedback and input to governors about how the zones should be designated. In fact, we're encouraging particularly folks in this network to be very active in that, regardless of whatever formal process the governor set in place. There's nothing to prevent that kind of input, and it's incredibly valuable. That said, the formal process in every state looks very different. So some have an open comment process for anyone from the public. Some are soliciting specifically from mayors alongside other types of open comment. I think folks should be proactive in this and not wait for an open invitation necessarily to provide that kind of input.
Is there a question about, I see something about job creation. Is this heavily based on job creation? I can't quite read it. Can you read that one? Yes.
This one?
Yes.
If this is heavily based on job creation, how is this used for affordable or workforce housing?
So I think it's flexible, like we talked about earlier, and again, from a community development perspective, I think both outcomes would be welcome. Whether you're creating high-quality jobs or housing that's affordable to low-income people, and I think it just depends on the interest of the investors and the funds that are going to be set up. And Kevin can step in, but I think he'd indicated LISC is going to pursue both.
Yep, that's right. Yeah, and as we were talking about the job creation focus earlier, that is really more on what LISC's focus is going to be, but this tool can be used broadly, and we don't see there being any job creation standards that get set by Treasury as part of rolling this program out.
Great. Next question. Do we believe that opportunity zone businesses will need to demonstrate that they conduct most of their business within zone tracts? an example of a trucking business based in a zone but serving a whole region?
So, I think that I should check my prescription before I got here. I was reading ahead to the next question.
So do we believe that opportunity zone businesses will need to demonstrate that they conduct most of their business within the
so, yeah, I was going to say, so there's the requirement, right, that 90% of the funds are invested in assets located in the tracts. And I do think, you know, this issue has come up with new markets where they had to really kind of delve into the regulations to determine, you know, for like a trucking company that has some of its assets in the tract, or a lawn services company that's kind of located within the low-income community but might be working outside the community. I think we're going to have to wait to see some more regulations about that particular piece. We have
time for
maybe one more question, and then we should probably wrap up.
Okay, this one.
Okay, I can't read it.
From LISC's analysis of the benefit of this program, can you talk to the potential impact of this program on revitalization capital for low-income communities?
Well, I think, you know, I'm going to let John weigh in. I'm going to tee it up first by saying that the potential for the amount of capital that could go into these communities is unlimited, right? You talked about the new market tax credit. That's a capped allocation, so there's only so much of that investment available. We had talked about, what, trillions of dollars that are sitting untapped that could potentially be reinvested in these, and I think if the states, if we first as the advocates inform the states and have them pick the census tracts we think really need this kind of investment, if they do that job, if we do a good job marketing the program and the investors, I think there's a lot of people that are really interested in socially motivated investments. I personally think it's you know, I don't want to say unlimited, but it's significant. And I don't know how you
agree. So the source capital being unrealized capital gains, we know that that's where the opportunity is really exciting, because there's a record amount of that type of wealth in the country now, and there's never been a connection before between that type of wealth and community development financing. So this creates that connection in a really powerful way at an important time. I think to echo Matt's point, when you survey the type of needs that exist around the country in these places and the type of incentives that exist federally, there is a bit of a mismatch, where there's an incompleteness to the spectrum of need in terms of the existing tools before this program to meet them. This is not a silver bullet, but it does get to a much broader diversity of the need spectrum when you consider housing, operating businesses, brownfield refurbishment, on and on and on, energy projects, the kind of things that really get more to the whole ecosystem of needs and opportunities within a community. And what a lot of the things I've been asked about in terms of covering the key bases, job creation, business creation, housing, affordable housing for the local workforce, all of those things are directly the interest areas of the investors that we're talking to. And so if you already have a proclivity or an expertise in those spaces, and you're motivated as somebody who wants to be engaged in revitalization efforts, it's almost harder to think of a non-use case than there is to think of all the potential use cases, because it's so broad. And that's what we think is so exciting about it, that there are folks who can really turbocharge their current efforts in deploying this capital.
All right, I think that'll be the last word.
Yes.
We're bumping up against our end time. Unless, Kevin, if you had any closing thoughts? Or
no, I don't. Thank you all for joining us today. And yeah, you have Matt and my contact information. So any further questions, would love to hear from you all.
Yeah, and I really apologize. The number of questions, like, and Jessica kept scrolling and scrolling. We apologize we couldn't get to them all. And then also the great turnout on this call. Over 300 people actually dialed in and listened in, and we really appreciate your interest. And thank you so much.
We'll be sure to send around the PowerPoint with active links, and we'll try and see if we can also answer a few more of the questions with that email. So thank you for joining.
Bye.